Hey, Eric here, and tonight I've got a quick little lesson for you guys. This isn't what I'd call a programming lesson, but I think it is a little technical. And that being said, I think it's something anyone who's involved in a startup early on should be familiar with. I titled this lesson, The Bare Minimum Every Startup Person Should Know About Domains and DNS. And I chose this topic because I've been involved in a few startups over the years, some of my own, some working for other people. And it's something I see come up often that becomes a blocker for getting what should be really simple things done and, moving forward on your actual business at hand. And so I want to give you guys just a few lessons on this. So we're going to go through some slides. I'm going to explain a few things, and then I'll give you some real world examples in the browser and in the terminal. So let's get going. First off, why is this important? Okay, I touched on it a little bit, but here's the real deal. If you know how to do some of this stuff, you're going to be able to get things done faster in your startup. And we all know speed is important because you got to move fast because you're on a tight timeline, you're on a runway, and you've got to move forward and get the growth going. So you don't want to get hung up on little technical things like this. Second, it lets your engineers, your software engineers, do actual engineering instead of having to interrupt them in a day and say, hey, I need you to get our email set up on Google, and can you help me set up these DNS records? You can do that yourself. Even if you're not an engineer, it's not that difficult. So understanding some of these principles lets your engineers engineer. And then third, and most important, this stuff has to be done for things like blogs. If you want your blog on a subdomain, you need to do it for landing pages. If you're using a tool like Unbounce or Lead Pages or other systems like HubSpot maybe, where you have people coming into a landing page from an ad campaign, you're probably going to map a subdomain to that. And so you need to know how that works. Okay? Your actual corporate or company or app website is going to have DNS configured for it to go live. You have app environments, like maybe you have a staging version of your web app. Maybe you have an API on a separate server. Those are going to need DNS configuration. Okay? Corporate email. You're going to probably set up email with something like Google Mail or Zoho. You need to create DNS records for that to work. And even support. A lot of companies use services like Zendesk, and you're going to maybe map a subdomain like help.mystartup.com, and you have to use DNS for that as well. So hopefully that's clear. DNS, it's a little mystifying at times, but it's crucial for getting a lot of components of your startup live and working, and you get those out of the way, and then you can move on to the important stuff. So that's the why. All right, so let's learn a couple terms. Okay, here we go. A domain, I'm sure you know this. A domain is basically your second level domain plus a top level domain. Those are just the fancy words for the .com or .net or .co part of it, and then the actual domain you choose, like mystartup.com or myawesomeiPhoneapp.io. That's your domain. Now, a domain is purchased from what's called a registrar, and I'll switch over real quick and show you. GoDaddy, of course, is a popular registrar. I use it for a couple domains. You can see it here. Namecheap is another favorite of mine. I don't have any affiliation with either of these other than that I use them to purchase domains. And so there's tons of registrars out there, and there have been for years. As long as the World Wide Web's been around, we've had domain registrars. So that's the first term, is your domain. Now, moving on, a subdomain. Now this is the prefixed extension to your actual domain. The most common and one you're probably most familiar with is www. That's actually the subdomain part of it. But a subdomain Could be something else like app.mystartup.com or staging.mystartup.com or blog.mystartup.com, just like we said before. Now, here's the very important thing to remember. Different subdomains on your domain can point to different servers or different hosts. So you can have your www subdomain pointing to your website, maybe hosted at somewhere like Squarespace. You can also have your blog on another subdomain at blog.mystartup.com. That can be hosted somewhere completely different, maybe on a server you control and you set up WordPress on. Maybe you're using another blogging service besides Squarespace. You can point it somewhere else. And that's a really important distinction because that allows us to set up all these services for our startup. And so subdomains, as I say here on the slide, useful for naming servers and separating your component services. All right. Now, DNS, that's kind of what this whole topic's about. DNS stands for Domain Name System. And this is just the overall system that lets you associate domains and subdomains with servers. Those are the machines where things are actually residing and running, and IP addresses. I'm not going to go into the technical details of all that, but basically the DNS system is what maps these subdomains and domains to their actual locations on servers and IP addresses. Now, another important distinction. DNS can be handled by your registrar, for example, GoDaddy, but it doesn't have to be. There are other services that help you manage DNS. Now let me show you an example here in the browser. So here's GoDaddy. Now I can have my domain here for my name, my personal homepage. I can have GoDaddy manage my DNS, but you can see right here, it's telling me, well, actually you have external name servers that are in play. And that's because I'm actually handling my personal domain's DNS with DigitalOcean, which is where I host it. So you can see in DigitalOcean, now DigitalOcean does not sell domains. They are not a registrar, but they do provide DNS services. And I've chosen to manage that here. And you can see under their networking control panel that I have all these records set up for my personal domain. And we'll get into some of these records in just a second. But it's an important distinction to make, is that you don't have to manage DNS at the same place you choose to buy your domain. You can, if you have a very simple DNS setup, you probably will. There's nothing wrong with GoDaddy's DNS service, but if you're using certain DNS services to manage a lot of traffic or to do caching or use a service like Cloudflare, you'll probably use their DNS system. So back to the slides. So here's some common DNS records that it's important to know about. I'd say these are the three most important. So the first is called a CNAME record. And that simply maps one subdomain to another subdomain. So you can take, for example, www.mystore.com. Let's say, for example, you have an online store and you want the homepage to map to one of your servers you control, and maybe that server is called server1.mystore.com. You simply create a CNAME from the www to server1. And the second record is what we call an A record, and that maps a subdomain or your root domain. You generally have to use an A record for your root domain, and that maps it, instead of to another subdomain, it maps it to an IP address. So for example, you have a blog for your store. You can see here on the slide. Maybe that maps directly to a server with an IP address. And that address is right there. So that's the difference between a CNAME and an A record. The main difference being one maps to another subdomain or host name, and an A record maps to an IP address. Now, the third, probably most common or most important DNS record is what we call an MX record. And that simply tells the DNS system where email is handled. And you can see, for example, if you use Google Apps, like a lot of companies do these days, they have their own MX records. So in order to get Google email set up at your own domain, you have to obviously go through the sign-up process, but you also have to complete configuring these MX records. And there's more details in their support pages. But those are the three most common DNS records you're going to probably be working with. So a couple real quick handy terminal commands. One's host, and that's just a simple DNS query. And another one's called dig, and that's a little more flexible and powerful tool for looking up DNS. So I'll show you how that works real quick. It can be in the terminal here. And let's say we want to see, where Hacker News points to. So we can say host news.ycombinator.com. Oh, I spelled that wrong. Okay, so it's saying that's an alias, so that's a CNAME for looks like a Cloudflare host name. And then host will say, well, we looked at there, and then we looked that one up, and that was an A record to this IP address. All right, so that makes sense. Well, let's see, maybe product hunt. So we get a little more info saying, well, it points to this IP address, gives you an IP6 address. Also looked up the MX records and set it up like that. So that gives you info, and this is a great way if you're setting up DNS for your own domain. It's a good way to check it, make sure things are pointing in the right place. All right, well, what about dig? Well, dig is, you can look at the man page. It's a little more involved. There's a lot of options and stuff, but simple version, I can look up my own personal domain, and I can say, well, how is what's the A record? All right, it's going to give me a bunch of DNS header information, querying it, and I can see, okay, so my personal domain has a record that points to this IP address. All right, so look through the man page or do a quick search, and you can get some more info on using those tools. They're quite handy. Now let's get to some real world examples. So I brought this up earlier. You got a startup, say mystartup.com. I bought my domain at GoDaddy, and I don't want to use its DNS, so I decided to use a DNS service at AWS. Amazon provides that. It's called Route 53. Pretty easy to set up. Okay, I've got that set up. Well, where am I going to point my stuff? Well, let's over here on the left with the actual application. Let's say I have a web app that I'm providing a service at. Set up my server. I'll work from the bottom up. Let's say I set up a server on DigitalOcean, couple servers maybe. I decided to name all my servers after quarterbacks, of course. So my first server is montana.mystartup.com. I provision a server on DigitalOcean. It's going to give me an IP address. Now I'm going to set the host name for that server, and I'm going to set up the DNS to have an A record to point montana.mystartup.com to that IP address. Now I wouldn't tell my users to go to montana.mystartup.com. That'd be hard to remember. So I'm going to map app.mystartup.com to it with a CNAME. And so That gives me a little bit of fallback. Say I want to have a backup server, running, or I want to make it easy to, switch servers out if I need to. Having that configuration is nice. Okay, well, I have a home page, and maybe my marketing people need to do a lot of content marketing, and I don't want them futzing around with the actual web app. I want to separate that. So I got the home page, maybe with some other static pages on a different server. So I've set up a different server that's just a static Nginx, server serving up HTML pages. So I'm set that up, called it merino.mystartup.com. I'm going to point that to a different IP that DigitalOcean gave me with an A record. And then I'm going to obviously set up my home page to be www. So I have that www as a CNAME to my Merino subdomain. So that's all set up. Well, I don't want all the assets for my web app. Maybe I have users uploading videos. I don't want to serve them directly from my server. So I'm going to use some kind of cloud storage system. Maybe I'm going to use S3, and I'm going to put CloudFront in front of that. So I'm going to have another subdomain. It's going to point to my maybe my CloudFront setup and my S3 setup. So I'm going to set up something like assets.mystartup.com. I'm going to have a CNAME pointing to that. Okay, so let's go over here. We got all this support and marketing stuff. I've got a blog. You can see with another CNAME pointing to WordPress. I've got a landing pages for all my ads I'm running, pointing to Unbounce, which is a landing page service. And I've set up Zendesk for all my customer support tickets, and I want that to look nice. I don't want it on a Zendesk domain, so I'm going to set up a help.mystartup.com subdomain there. So you can see all these, I would say, crucial components of your startup are going to be handled and managed by this DNS system. So the nice thing is DNS lets you, use these services in different places, and that's that key component where each subdomain can point to a different server or a different service. Okay, you're not locked in where everything on your domain has to point to separate or to the same service. Excuse me. So, okay, that's the last slide. So let's look at this one more time, sort of in a real startup that I was poking around. So let's see here. Gusto is a online or sort of startup focused payroll service, and I have no affiliation with Gusto. I have used it in the past at startups I worked for that used it, and it's a nice service. It helps manage a lot of payroll and takes some of the headaches out of some of that HR administrative stuff. So, well, okay, Gusto has a homepage at gusto.com. Now, let's see here. Well, maybe I can see what. Okay, so looks like they're just pointing to some IP address and using Gmail or Google for their email. Okay, well, look at this. When I go to sign in to actually use the Gusto app, that goes to app.gusto.com, which looks like might be some kind of possibly a Rails or a Node.js app. And you can see here, looks like that's pointing to a Amazon EC2 instance or a load balancer. So you can see already they've got some of these components split up just like I mentioned previously. What about what about their, let's see, what about their help? Oh, look, their you go to their help service. It looks like using some service like Zendesk or something, and that's on another subdomain, support.gusto.com. How about their blog? It looks like that's part of their main domain, so that's probably in the same location as their homepage. So So you can see they have a bunch of different services they're using for their startup, and they're all pointing in different spots. So a good example of what I explained here. I hope that you learned a little bit about DNS, and encourage you to explore it a little more. And even if you're not a technical member of your startup, it's very easy to get familiar with this stuff, and you can provide a lot of value by being able to handle this yourself and help your startup move quicker. All right, good luck.